Welcome to one of my favourite little reservoirs in Cambridge, somewhere I come to get a little bit of a bend in the rod and have a bit of fun. After a couple of hours of mucking around, finding a spot and baiting up, we're into our first fish, which is been a while since I've fished, probably a month or so since I've had line in the water, so it's nice to be in touch with one. What I've basically done, I got here early this morning. I try and get here as close to first light as I can. Found some fish on this side of the lake. The wind was blowing over here when I first got here. I knew it was going to change, but I thought I'll fish where the fish are showing. And I had a good cast round just with a lead on the end of the marker rod, and just tried to fill down in an area that I'd made notes on before a couple of winters ago. I fished this swim, didn't catch anything out of it, but had a good cast round in it. And there was a nice area out there at 12 3/4 rod lengths, but it had weeded up a little bit, to be honest. And it was strange. I started putting the lead out just on on its own on the braid, and it felt okay. And then I swapped over to a stainless steel weed rake, little tiny 4-ounce one, and it was obvious there was a lot of silkweed out there. It was alive with food, the silkweed, absolutely alive with food. Just before I started baiting up, I just cast a few rod lengths to the right and it went down with a real crash. Pulled it back and there was hardly any weed on it. So that was the spot, and baited up, probably put about, I suppose about 10 spods out, and no boilie at all in this session. All particle, and then I've decided to fish plastic on every rod over the top, because I've done really well on plastic here before, and I want to use it as a bit of a non-boilie session. So show you how I fish particle, what rigs I use for the plastic, and how to muck around with the different colours and buoyancies to get the best out of it. This little fella is ready to come in the net, so I'm going to stop talking and land him. Pretty little carp he is too. Come on fella, in you come. First of many, hopefully. Ooh. Yes, got him. Wicked, a good start. And there we have it. 14.5 pounds, well chuffed to get this one. It's always good to get the first one of the day, and hopefully there's a lot more to come. We're obviously going to talk tactics, the rigs I'm using, the techniques I'm using, new materials that I'm using as well, and of course the all important bait. So we're going to slip him back into this crystal clear water. That's why they're so dark as this. Who cares how big they are when they look as pretty as that, eh? Get him back and get that rod back out. It's important to get the rod bang on the money as quickly as possible. So I've gone round the poles, 12 3/4 rod lengths. I've got a little bit of marker elastic on there as well, so that if I wanted to wind in without getting a fish on the end, I could line it up with a third ring down, which is where I've tied it on all the rods, and then I know it's going to go back in the spot. But dropping it back on that hot area is so important. It's just slicking up out there, which means the fish are feeding on the bait, oil's being released off it, and there's like a little flat spot out in the wind, which means I could get another one any minute. So I'm going to get this out, a couple more spodfuls over the top just to increase the feeding activity, and hopefully we'll catch another one. Okay. Watch it in the air, dink, hit the clip. That's it, nice soft thud. Now that rod actually is in a little bit more weed than the other two, and it's the first one to go. So it may mean that the fish are more interested in the hook bait when it's sitting in the weed. The clear spot to the right of it, it might be a bit too obvious because I've got popped up corn on every rod, but in the weed it might just nestle in and just look like a free offering, and that may have been why I got the bite. It came on the IB corn, which is yellow, obviously the same colour as what I'm putting out there. Normally I'd expect the pink to go, which is on the other two rods, but this time it hasn't happened. So if I get another bite on this rod, I'll be clipping them up, winding the others in, putting IB on those as well and putting them back out there, because if there's something on the day that you're getting more bites, you want to swap everything over to that. Well, I've been mucking around with different colours and buoyancies, and had loads of fish showing over the area. A couple of what seemed like aborted chances, one on the white banoffee and one on the pink squid, and lo and behold, the IB yellow corn popped up, has done the next bite. So that tells me really everything I need to know, and all the rods want to be swapped onto that now. It's been very frustrating the last couple of hours. There's been a lot of fish showing, and this has come completely out of the blue. I haven't done any summer fishing on here for quite a few years. When you come back to a lake from a long time away, it takes a bit of time to look at him going. It takes a bit of time to get back in the swing of it again before you master it. There is absolutely no substitute for hours on the bank. Come on, in you come. You come. Get in that net. Yes, got him. Oh, very welcome. How about that for a bar of gold? £21 12 ounces, taken on a little size 8 crank hook, and the dark matter braided hook link that sinks down on the bottom really well, and the IB corn. On these lakes where you get loads of bites, you cannot sit on your hands. You have to keep working, you have to keep mucking about, and eventually you will unlock the code. So this is how I fish with plastic corn. First of all, the pop-up version, and I would use a pop-up, one if the fish are very hungry, they're not being caught a lot. Sometimes something a bit more blatant and a bit more in their face gets more bites than a slow sinking bottom bait. And sometimes you need to combat the weed, which I do here. There's lots of different kinds of weed on the bottom out there, a bit of Canadian, bit of silkweed, and I just want to lift that hook up off the bottom so when the fish sucks it in, the hook doesn't get caught in the weed and it can go in its mouth. So the simplest one first. If you can tie the knotless knot, then you can do this rig. And all I've basically done is tied the knotless knot onto that size 8 crank hook. I've done 7 or 8 turns up, pulled the hair out of the way, a couple more turns to force the hair out at an angle, back through the eye, and that's the rig done. The hair is very short. I've got the banoffee version on here. That's based on my banoffee hook bait. So in all of these, the attractors that have gone into them are the ones that have lasted the test of time in our own fishing when we're making our own pop-ups. And that banoffee, especially in the white colour, is an absolutely brilliant combination. And then the counterbalance there, all I've done is slid a small size sinker onto the hook link before obviously I've tied the bit at the end of it, and then just put a bit of the dark matter putty round it, just rolled it round, and because that putty is so heavy, you only need a little tiny drop in like that to counterbalance it so it just sits up off the bottom. And this is the new dark matter braid. This is £20. Personally, I'd rather use 15 because when the fish are feeding over little bits and pieces, you've got bits of hemp out there, bits of corn, little tiny pellets, they're sieved in the bait. They're not really sucking it in like they would do with a 20mm boilie, so everything needs to move around quite easily, and that's why braid works so well. And then the next one up, this is probably my favourite braided version. I'm using Supernatural in 25, and you can see there I've added a couple of extra sinkers onto that, and those two sinkers help it to settle into the weed and look as natural as humanly possible. The counterbalance is exactly the same, just a small size sinker, just with a little bit of putty round it, and then on the hook there's a slight change there. All I've done is put a rig ring onto the shank of the hook and then tied a simple overhand knot around it and then tied the short hair. And on this one I've got the IB corn, which probably is the most successful one of the lot. Everyone loves yellow, so it probably gets used a lot more than the others, but that flavour combination in there comes from Ali Hamidi and it's an absolute winner. And then the next one down, this is a classic combi rig, but the simplest way of tying it. So there I've got the end trap semi-stiff, I've stripped a little bit back, tied my favourite whipping knot again, put the rig ring around the hook, and on this one I've got the fruity squid, which is based on the attractors that I used in the underwater film that I was lucky enough to catch that big plated on. Those same attractors have gone into that corn, and in all of this range the attractors are actually put into the plastic before it's moulded into a piece of corn, so it's allowed to absorb in, then it goes into the moulding machine, so it's in that corn permanently. So even if you bring it out the water after 10 hours, there's still some smell in it. And then the counterbalance there, you couldn't get simpler than that. It's just a split shot squeezed onto the exposed braided section, just heavy enough to sink it. If it's not quite heavy enough, I would mould a little bit more of the dark matter putty round it just to get it to sink nice and slowly. And then probably the most complicated one, it's the one that I like using in this sort of situation where the water is absolutely tap water clear. I'm using an IQ boom that I've tied to 25 pound supernatural, and I've done that using the Albright knot. And what you basically do, make a big loop in the boom section, in the mono section, go through that loop with your braid, around both bits of line 6 times, back up a couple and back the way you came through that same loop, and then just pull it all down tight. And that's a really great join between those two materials. Trim the ends off, and then your bit of putty actually goes around the knot, so it's got a bit of purchase to hold it on. And if you find in weedy conditions where you're stripping weed off the line all the time when you wind it in, if your putty's moving, dry everything out first. Don't try and do it with wet hands. A little tiny dab of super glue on the knot, and then put the putty back on again, let it all dry out, and that help it to stay on. Because sometimes when you're casting and repeatedly winding in, trying to hit a spot and there's weed round it, if you keep pulling the weed off, you will move the putty. There's no way of avoiding that. So by drying it out and using a little bit of super glue, you can keep it on that little bit more permanent. And this particular version of the hook bait, believe it or not, started off as a banoffee, but I've soaked in the Almond Supreme. And if you want one of the goos to soak into the plastic, use the Supremes, which are the thin ones. So Garlic Supreme's brilliant, Pineapple Supreme is really good on the IB, and on this one I've put the almond, and that's turned that white banoffee hook bait bright pink. So it's worth mucking about with those as well, because sometimes you can find that a colour or a flavour on the day is much better than any other. At the moment it seems to be the IB, so I've got that on all 3 rods, but I'll keep mucking around during the session and changing things around, and it might be that the green one ends up being the one that gets the bites. So that leads me nicely onto this last one. Again, I've got an IQ boom tied to supernatural, and here I've incorporated a captor hook, so a coloured hook. So if you're finding the fish are really spooky, the water's really clear, then a coloured hook like that doesn't stand out so much. And I think as long as you make the hook bait more visual than the actual hook underneath it, then I think you've got a chance of getting a bite. And you'll see with all of these I'm using quite small hooks. One, because they're not very heavy, so it allows that corn to pop up off the bottom, but also because the hook is sitting up straight off the bottom, it is more visible. So I like to keep the hook nice and small, makes them very sharp as well, and that's how I get my bites using pop-ups. And if I'm going to use this with a PVA stick or a PVA bag, what I'll do, make the bag up, then I'll put a needle through it, cut the top of the bag and the bottom of the bag just to cut a little bit of the PVA, and then use the chodit tool to make a huge hole through the middle of the PVA bag, and that means I can pull the counterbalance through without moving the putty or moving the split shot. So it's a good little tip. If you're finding it a struggle to get the counterbalance through the PVA bag, use the chodit tool to make a great big hole, and then it will go through there really easily. And then if it's not working on pop-ups, if the bottom's really clean and the pop-ups are too high off and you can't get a bite, then I'll move over to a slow sinker. And that's a classic situation there. All you've got here is a mainline dumbbell that's just cut in half, and then one of the IB corns on top of it. The hook will lay flat on the bottom, the bait will just sit up above, and that can get you bites when pop-ups don't. And then the last one, another great combination, using the white banoffee on the top and then a darker bottom bait. You imagine you've got dark baits all over the swim and there's one little bit of white. That can be enough to get them to hone in on that and get the bite first. So if you're going to use plastic Kong, that's what I recommend. It can be as simple as you want or as advanced as you want. If you choose something here, you'll be getting bites. Well, as the red barons fly overhead, we're into another one, and I've swapped over to a much bigger hook and a slow sinking bit of pink maize, size 4 curve shank, believe it or not, and 1 grain of maize on a much shorter hook link, because I just felt the fish might be getting away with it, and this rod's gone again. Not a big fish at all, but he's a bite. It just shows you on days when it seems like you should be catching more, there is something you can do to get an extra bite. And this time it appeared to be nailing it to the deck and shortening the hook link. Okay. Lovely colour, these fish. This clear water makes them really dark and golden. Come on, in you come, in you come. Yes, got him. Wicked. And there he is, 16 pounds on the button. And it just shows you if they're showing all over you and you're not getting action, it may not be the bait, it may not be the hook, it might just be the wrong height off the bottom. And by moving to a bit of pink plastic, this time the maize, slow sinking, really close to the bottom with a little PVA stick, that's what's done the bite. A bigger hook and a shorter hook link. So ringing the changes can get you more bites.